Text. I'm gonna read it out first and then go into it. Are you feeling uncomfortable when others are having conversations on topics that make you feel uneasy? I noticed when I am having a passionate conversation, I get interrupted because there's an assumption that the space I'm in is not for certain types of conversations. That makes me feel very uncomfortable. I can understand how that might make you feel uneasy when you see a passionate conversation looking like conflict. When I'm cut off in a conversation, it makes me very frustrated. What I need in those moments are peace and awareness. Can I request that you don't interrupt my conversations with others? If you find that to be too challenging, it might help if we hang out one-on-one instead of in groups. I understand that can feel very frustrating. I don't want to dishonor and disrespect myself in order to help others feel more secure in the spaces where I feel safe. So, first of all, I want to say what I like about this is that it's very honest, and it's also there's a lot of self-awareness in it. So I would say this is much better than how most people would typically communicate if they experience something like this. One thing that makes it hard for the other person to receive something like this is that it's pretty long. It's a lot of words, it's a lot of text. So, and there's all kinds of different things in it. I understand, Nancy, that you wrote this down or came up with this like spontaneously and didn't craft it or anything. But if somebody receives this much information at once, it's going to be difficult for them to process everything. It's going to be difficult for them to remember the beginning of the message by the time you get to the end of it. And so it'll be difficult to respond to it. Even if it's a text message, this is a lot of information. And so the first thing that I would suggest is to make it much, much shorter. Also, if you want to stick to an NVC type of structure, then you would begin with the observation. What actually happened? So this would be this part. I notice when I'm having a passionate conversation, I get interrupted because there's an assumption that the space I'm in is not for certain types of conversations. So let me put this here in the beginning and label it observation. And in order for this to be received well, I would make it more specifically about a particular event or incident versus it sounding like you're calling out a whole pattern of the other person. While that may be true, it's going to be much harder for the other person to receive it to receive it well than if you point it out as a specific event. So I would say I noticed when I was having a passionate conversation, I got interrupted. And then this part, because there's an assumption that the space I'm in is not for certain types of conversations. This is something that this is your interpretation of what the other person was thinking or where the other person was coming from. And that is very problematic because even if it's true, the other person will likely have resistance to you just telling them what their point of view is or what they were thinking. So in NVC, you would not do something like this. So let's skip it. This part here. Are you feeling uncomfortable when others are having conversations on topics that make you feel uneasy? That to me sounds like an attempt of empathizing with the other person and of trying to understand the other person. This is a good thing to do in my point of view. It's not the typical NVC structure. This wouldn't come at this point, but I also don't see anything wrong with it. So might as well empathize at this point, and say something like, again, specific to this event, were you feeling uncomfortable when my conversation went the way it did? And now you want to give them a chance to respond. Because if you're honestly trying to find out if that's how they felt, then give them a chance to respond to it. And then maybe this will spark a whole conversation that, creates mutual understanding. Once there's room for it, once you feel like they are ready to hear you, or even regardless of that, once you want to take the next step, you can express your own feelings and needs in the situation. So this would be the next step in the MVC structure. And what you said here is, that makes me feel very uncomfortable. I can understand how that might make you feel uneasy when you see a passionate conversation looking like conflict. That's not about you, that's about the other person again. And here this is about you. When I'm cut off in a conversation, it makes me very frustrated. So the feelings would be, again, specific, focus on the event, on the incident. When I was interrupted, I felt very uncomfortable. And frustrated. Then you said, what I need in those moments are peace and awareness. So this would be the needs. However, this is interesting because awareness is not something that you need, as in you need to be more aware. But what you're trying to say is, the other person needs to have an awareness of what is happening for you to be happy, or for you to feel comfortable and less frustrated, not frustrated. When you're expressing your needs, you wouldn't point at something the other person needs, or the other person needs in your point of view, but you're trying to name the needs that are present for you, for yourself. Like, what need of yours is not met right now, or wasn't met in that situation. And I would say, this is just me guessing now, if you were here, you could correct me or interrupt me, but I would say it was something like self-expression, or a space for self-expression, and understanding. Like, if you want the other person to be aware, then for you that would be understanding, that you need understanding. So I would say something like, what I needed in that moment, again, specifically talking about this one incident, what I needed in that moment was space to express myself, and understanding. So the feelings would be uncomfortable and frustrated, and the needs would be space, self-expression, express myself, and understanding. And now I would give the person again a chance to respond. You could also add something like, does that make sense? And And now you're giving the person a chance to let you know whether they heard what you just said, whether they can hear and understand your feelings and needs in that situation. And in an ideal world or in an ideal exchange, they would see it right away and they'd be like, oh wow, okay, I wasn't aware of that. I can see how this is how you were feeling, and this is what you were needing. But in the reality, oftentimes, especially when there's, when people feel triggered or judged, or then there's emotion involved, then they won't get to that point so quickly. So the understanding in MVC is that it takes a few rounds of doing this, of expressing your feelings and needs, basically saying the same thing over and over, slightly different, with a different syntax, but you're saying the same thing again and again until they heard you. Because they may respond with something like, I didn't interrupt you, or, well, then if you don't want to have me around, then I might as well go somewhere else, or something like that. They may see judgment in your in what you say, even if this is perfect MVC, even if this is the perfect way of expressing yourself and there's nothing judgmental in it whatsoever. They might still feel judged, simply because people often look for the judgment even when there is none. And then the MVC way to go about it would be to say something like, hey, it wasn't my intention to say something judgmental or triggering. I was trying to let you know how I was feeling and what I was needing in that moment. Let me try again. And then you say it again. And then it may take a few rounds. And this is where, this type of conversation, communicating also, it's not a quick fix oftentimes. It takes patience. But the powerful thing is that it will almost certainly, in my experience, work if you give it enough patience and if you give it enough room. So once the person hears you, sees your feelings and needs, and doesn't feel judged anymore, then you can move on to the next step, which would be the request, which you already had in there in your text. If you find that to be too challenging, it might help. Hold on, this is the other thing. Can I request that you don't interrupt my conversations with others? This would be the request. I'm not a fan of this choice of words, can I request, because this is like asking for permission to even make a request, which is probably not what you, if you're like really honest, is probably not what you're trying to say here. But it's, you kind of like this, something like this can still sound like you're saying, yeah, you're packaging it as a request, but you're actually saying, hey, this is my request, deal with it. So in MVC, a request is always a real request, meaning it's not a demand, it's a request, and the answer to it can always be no. That's totally fine if the answer is no. So I would probably change this to something like, would it be okay for you to not interrupt me, next time you find me in a heated conversation? Also, not interrupt me. It sounds kind of negative, so you could also make it sound a bit more positive by saying something like, would it be okay for you to, if that next time you find me in a heated conversation, you just let me speak or let me talk, which, implies that you don't want to be interrupted, but you're saying it in a more positive way, that you want to have room to express yourself. And then the person may, and then what's important here is that this is specifically about next time. So it's not about every time from now on when you see me in a situation like that, can you now promise that you will never interrupt me ever again? Because that's very difficult to commit to, and it's just not realistic. So instead, an MVC request is always as specific as possible, and as actionable as possible. It should be something that is easy for the other person to say yes to, also saying yes to your request doesn't mean that it's a promise that it won't happen. It's just they are willing to try. That's what the request is about. Are you willing next time to try not to interrupt me, basically? And only if they say no to this request would I bring this up. If you find that to be too challenging, I might help if we hang out one-on-one instead of groups. Let's say there's a no. Then you could say this. But yeah, that's nothing wrong with that. I would add, what do you think of that? You always want to give the other person a chance to respond and to be genuine about your requests and your suggestions, and not make it sound like this is what pick A or B, that's all you got. But like really give them time to let this sink in and respond. If you find that to be too challenging, it might help if we hang out one-on-one instead of in groups. What do you think of that? Yeah. So that would be my way of structuring and breaking the whole thing up to make it more MVC and make it more likely that the other person can receive it well, and then there's actually a productive exchange. Hope this helps. Let me know.